Good morning. This is Oba Tashaka, and welcome to the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. The topic for this morning is a very important topic. It's really key to everything that we'll do on this show, and it's really key to my best work. The topic for this morning is the key that unlocks the door to just societies. The key that unlocks the door to just societies. So this is an extremely important topic. Before getting into that, I just want to go through some basic things that's key to this show. First, I want to continue to thank all the viewers for taking an interest in the show, and encourage you to encourage your friends, associates to also check it out, and encourage everyone to hit the subscriber button. This is extremely important. We've gone over our first 1,000 viewers, and we want to grow much larger, because basically I'm doing this because I want to reach the largest audience of people possible, especially young people, but all ages. And so it's very important that we increase our subscriber list. So encourage everyone to not only watch the show, but to subscribe to it. And before getting into the topic of the show today, I just want to make a few comments to remind people that since we hit the 1,000 viewer mark, and we're now at about 1,140 viewers, you'll see at the bottom of this screen a place where you can click on. It's featured https://gumroad Dr. Oba Tashaka. Click that, and you can get the books, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, and The Art of Leadership, Volume 1. And you can also get a DVD on the book that I'm finishing now on SEBA, or on mastering. And this is a speech that I delivered to an ASCAC conference in Detroit in 1997. And it's well done. And it introduces the first level of SEBA, or the African System of Mastery. So check out this, because to really get what I'm having to say here, it's very important that you do some reading. Can't lead unless you read. And some of you may not have the desire to be a leader of a movement, but you're the leader of yourself. And in this era today, everybody's got to be a leader on that level. So the topic for this morning's show is the key that unlocks the door to just societies. I'm dedicating this show to my neighbor who's incognito, and to his family, the Levine family. And the reason I'm dedicating this show to the Levine family is they are a model for what I'm going to be discussing this morning, the key that unlocks the door to just societies. Because believe it or not, we have Black folks who are actually living balanced lives, in good relationships, and raising beautiful families. And they may not put a name to what's behind what they're doing. And there's a whole lot of mother wit in this. My neighbor's mother had a saying that she said, "I may be a little piece of leather, but I'm well put together." And we all have mothers and fathers and grandparents who taught us the lessons to be great human beings. So this show is dedicated to the topic of the key that unlocks the door to just societies. This is really key from my life because I'm a warrior scholar, you know, the O.R., the original revolutionary. And my drive, as it has been for most of our people, is to unlock the keys to just societies. What's the key to it? What's the basis of it? This has been my big search. Even when I entered the movement, the Black Freedom Movement in 1960, I wasn't conscious that that was the search that I was on. I just knew I was joining a movement that promised freedom for our people. We talk about freedom now. We know that there's certain freedoms we can get now, others are going to take longer to get. So later, I discovered that was my reason for being in the movement. A lot of people join movements to join people. I joined to join a fight. And it's the cause that's always been most important to me and the pursuit of the truth. And so this show is going to get into the heart of the meaning of just societies. And it's the core of, I think, what's most important for humans on this planet is to know it and then to take part in actualizing it or helping to bring it into being. And I think many people across the planet have struggled for this. Many Black folks have struggled for this. And so this is a key that I'm going to be offering for unlocking this door. And what I'm going to be sharing with you comes out of my most important work that is expressed in my book, Return to the African Mother, Principle of Male and Female Equality, the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I thought whipping the biggest institution, at least the biggest bank in the world, the Bank of America, that was my biggest organizational achievement. But I found that in writing this book that took 15 disciplines to write, 5 years to write, this was the most difficult thing I ever did and the most rewarding and the most beautiful. And I want to say this is a mandate of African-American culture for all of you that think you don't have one. And for those of you who know you do. George Washington Carver's research assistant would often say that Professor Carver's objective was to bring beauty where there's ugliness. He invented paints, one of which was a Egyptian blue, as he called it. And he invented this paint that lasted for over 30 years so that sharecroppers, Black folks who had less than nothing could have some color in their shacks to beautify it. So my mandate is always that, to bring beauty and to replace ugliness with beauty. My first art is strategy. It's the ultimate art, next only to God, love, and it is founded on the truth and next to the truth. And strategy, when it's executed by masters, is beautiful. And a lot of people, they'll say, why does he dress like that? Well, we come out of a people who have a sense of nobility. And that's certainly my attitude. So what I'm trying to do on these shows is give you beauty, present to you beauty. And when the beauty comes through the beautiful light, and we've had 5 shows on God within, where we talk about the God that's within each human being and each Black person, that's where the ultimate beauty is. And what I'm going to share with you this morning comes from the beautiful light and comes through me, doesn't come from me, though I put my own stuff into it. The source is higher than any of us, the source of the most beautiful, God. So this morning, we'll be focusing on the keys to just societies and unlocking the door to them. We've had two shows on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, on his life and then his assassination. And we've had one 3-hour show on the assassination of El Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, or better known as Malcolm X. And what we noted in both of these shows, and I want to say to Professor Menu Ampin, if you watch this, you did wonderful work. I know that everyone that watched this, we've received a number of comments, realize it, and Baba Zak Kondo, the same thing, in his insights on El Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, better known as Malcolm X, especially his assassination. Now, what these three shows all had in common was that by the end of their life, King and Malcolm had come to the same conclusion. They had come to the same conclusion that the most developed arms of the Black freedom movement, Black power movement, or what we'd also call the Black liberation movement, the conclusions that many of our best scholars have reached and many of our people have yearned for and sought answers for. They had reached the conclusion that this society is not structured to produce freedom. I've made reference to Malcolm's parable before, where he said that America was no more designed to produce freedom than a chicken is designed to produce a duck egg. He said, if a chicken could produce a duck egg, it would be a revolutionary chicken. If America could produce freedom, it would be a revolutionary system. I've made that reference before, and this is an indication of Malcolm's orientation, both in the nation and outside, which was that of a revolutionary, but by the end of his life, a clarity on what some of the things needed to be done to bring this about, or a better view of what needed to be done. And his travels in Africa helped to expose him to that, meeting with some of the most progressive and radical African leaders at that time. And as Menu Ampin pointed out, King had similar exchanges with African leaders, and the leaders that he spoke about were some of the most progressive leaders on the African continent, attending Kwame Nkrumah's independence ceremony. And he was the most visionary of the Africans when it comes to the issue of African unity. And then he was privileged to meet with Julius Nyerere, who I also met with in 1977, had a 2-hour meeting with him in front of his house in Dar es Salaam. And he was observing what they were doing because he wanted some ideas about long-term answers for Blacks in this country and around the world. So advanced wings of the Black freedom movement, Black power movement, Black Panther movement, and many others, and I would think now Black Lives Matter movement, had reached a similar conclusion. And it was that freedom was not possible for Blacks, people of color, for the poor in this society or around the world under the current social, political, and economic, and I might point out cultural system. Not too many of us who talk about the need to change the way the society is structured will talk about what's wrong with the culture of this society. But it's actually the way you think that determines who you are. And it is out of the culture of the West really that springs the concept of the unjust society. And by the way, the book on Seba, which I've come up with a title for right now, Seba, the Light of Wisdom, where to know the truth is to be the truth. That is basically what this work that I'm finished is based on. It's based on the assumption that if we're going to make a society crooked straight, we better understand the thought system, the philosophy of the people who constructed this system, so that when we go about reconstructing, coming up with a just society, we'll certainly know what we're up against and what we really have to replace, because it's deep down inside of many of us and we don't even know it. Now, so the most revealing part of the discussion with Professor Menu Ampin on King was his discussion on the second phase of King's life from 65 on. And that this second phase of King's life was his revolutionary phase. And during this second phase, King had concluded that the society needed to be restructured. In my book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, I make the point that Malcolm was a revolutionary in the Nation of Islam, and he was a revolutionary outside the Nation of Islam when he was forced out. But in the last year of his life, where he was free from restrictions, then you saw the greatest growth, the greatest development of his revolutionary ideas. He was able to begin to reach out to the Black freedom movement in ways he had encouraged the nation to do before he was forced out. He was able to move across the African continent and interact with African leaders. He was able to attend the Organization of African Unities meeting and present a petition calling on the heads of state to begin to take an interest in the struggle of African people in the United States. And so he was beginning to grow. And if you listen to his last speech that I've referred to once before on this show, the last message, while that was not his best delivered speech because he had been put under sedation, his house had been firebombed the night before, his family had barely escaped with their life. This speech, the last message, has some of the deepest insights that Malcolm would share with us during his whole period of leadership. And it basically had to do with appreciating the power of African people in the United States, appreciating our strategic power, and appreciating just how central the Black struggle for liberation in the United States was in the context of the world, seeing it as a central struggle in the world. So both King and Malcolm, by the end of their lives, and Malcolm much earlier, were pursuing a revolutionary course. And this convergence that they particularly began to experience occurs in 1965, and Malcolm, of course, is assassinated February 21st of 1965. But what we don't know, most of us, is that while they only met once and shared a photograph in front of the House of Representatives right outside of a meeting in the House of Representatives that Malcolm had attended, they were sharing, exchanging some positions with King's attorney. And there was agreement by both King and Malcolm that the struggle had entered a human rights phase. So when we look at how the images of both Malcolm and King have been distorted, then what we need to understand is that that distortion was viewed to be necessary by the white power elite, because the radicalization of the two most popular leaders in the movement if that was allowed to go forward, would seep down into the masses of Black people, which it had already done. I don't think they fully understood or appreciated that. That happened with members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee calling for Black power. That happened within the Congress of Racial Equality. I led the Black nationalist wing, and there was a radicalization inside the Congress of Racial Equality of a wing of the members of that movement. And that happened deeply among other forces in the Black freedom movement. Revolutionary Action Movement, RAN, a wing of the Black Panther Party that would come forward later. So the fact that it's a revelation for a lot of us to know that King was a revolutionary is only a revelation because of the way in which the media, the power elite, has succeeded in distorting King's image and reducing it to "I have a dream" speech, and reducing it to his appeal to the moral consciences of America. By 65 and on, King realized the system didn't have a conscience. And even later, he was talking about us getting out of the value system of the system. And Malcolm had been arguing this a lot earlier. The key point that I made with Menu Ampin was that when King and Malcolm came to a common agreement on the need for restructuring this society, they had done what had not happened in African-American history before. Harold Cruz, who's one of our great scholars, wrote a masterpiece, a classic called Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And that book's a classic because he identified the two streams that have been central in Black political movements, the stream of integration and the stream of Black nationalism. And what he showed was that Frederick Douglass represented the integrationist stream. And then he showed that Martin R. Delaney, who some of you may not have heard of, who was the greatest intellectual that we produced in the 19th century, a medical doctor, highest ranking Black soldier in the Civil War, a major, and a member of the Loyal League that I pointed out before, plotted the strategy for pushing the government to end slavery during the Civil War. And they had plotted this years before the Civil War happened. These were the smartest people in the country. And so Harold Cruz's book identifies these two wings, with King and Malcolm reaching an agreement. And not only King and Malcolm, but more radical sectors in the Black liberation movement reaching a similar set of conclusions, that the real issue in ending poverty, in ending oppression in this society in general and throughout the world, the real issue had to do with restructuring it. King had had a staff meeting right after the voting rights law was signed into law. And he basically said, there's something wrong with this country. He said, capitalism's no good. We made that point when we were looking at King. And Malcolm had reached a similar conclusion. And while King didn't embrace Marxism, he agreed with Marx's critique of capitalism, that it was a blood-sucking system, which is how Malcolm described this system. Malcolm had not even read Marx and didn't need to. You don't need to be a revolutionary to read Marx. In fact, all Marx does is give you a good critique of what's wrong with the economic system, not so much the racial system. And Marx does not give you the answers for the alternative to it. Marxists have just started to admit that with the failure of their project in Russia and the shift of the Chinese from communism to market capitalism, which has taken 400 million people out of poverty in China, but also created great disparities of wealth in China. But still, they've done more for the poor than any other country on the planet. right now. So the fact that King and Malcolm had reached this agreement means that if you want to be honest about it, these two streams are not really the real deal anymore. Because the reality is, while we have a right to go back to Africa, because that was a major stream in the Black nationalist wing, the Garvey wing, and those that want to have every right to, this is our homeland. The bulk of our people will not be returning to Africa. We're going to have to bring the best of Africa here. And that's what we've been doing consciously and sometimes unconsciously with the movements that we've thrown forward, which have been acts of culture and through our culture itself. So this means that while all of our people aren't on board on this, it means that we have really reached a juncture in our history. And that juncture is where at least our most advanced sectors understand that freedom is going to have a long-term objective tied to it. And that long-term objective is going to have to be one that provides answers for keys to the just society, answers for ending poverty. And I don't know if you're ever going to have answers for ending racism, but if you're in power and you're in the majority, you should be able to put that in check. I'm not going to suggest that I have the answers for ending racism. You hear me? But what we can do is put it in a box. And with the demographic shifts that are going on in this country, you're going to be in a position to do that, provided that you realize the power that you have. So this show is entitled "The Key That Unlocks the Door to Just Societies." And so it requires us to focus on the long term while we're dealing with day-to-day issues. And I really want to stress this. While my focus this morning is going to be on the keys to unlocking the door to just societies, I'm not talking about something far off, because what you're going to see is the key that unlocks that door to just societies has to be applied today. And based on how you'll see it actually works, it can be applied today. And I'm telling you, I'm living proof of it. And I'm dedicating the show to a family that embodies this, the Levine family, but I know a whole lot of others who do, and individuals as well. And so this is always the rule for any model that works. You got to be able to apply it now, not just 100 years from now. And that's also how you test things out, get the kinks out of them, make them to work. But I can tell you this one works because it comes from not God, God. You hear me? God. It's beautiful. So by the end of their lives, both King and Malcolm had redefined the struggle as not a civil rights struggle, but a human rights struggle. Malcolm internationalizing it, King focusing on the fact that inside the society, what we had to do is go beyond the rights, the right to vote, the right to assemble, the right to free speech. And we had to go to the powers. And so King was quite practical with his orientation. And Malcolm had also reached a similar conclusion. And so King advised his people that now we're into the area that is not going to be so easy for our allies to support, because as long as it doesn't cost anything, and you're just talking about giving people the right to vote, which we see now, there's a big resistance to all these southern states coming up with ways to prevent us from having the victories that we've had right now. And while it's easy to write a law that says segregated facilities are out, it ain't gonna be so easy to put a roof over people's head, put money in people's pocket, give people health care that prolongs their life. And it's really not going to be easy to transform a society that hasn't done this into one that will do this. So the emphasis on human rights was extremely important. In stressing the human rights component of the movement, King and Malcolm, they were both focusing on the long-term objective. And a key thing to get straight in life and in struggle and in general thought is that if you're going to sustain yourself in anything, you have to have an overall vision, an overall idea that guides you. We've been looking at the God within. And one of the things in the God within series we were talking about was how everyone has within them gifts. And that these gifts in ancient Kemet, they called this the Ka, or among the Yoruba, the Ori. It's your destiny. It's the gifts that when you apply them, they're a reflection of your wishes, your desires, and when you really work on them, that becomes your destiny. And so in life, it's important to have objectives. And one of the most important objectives in life is to fulfill your God-given gifts. When you do that, you are really in the realm of heaven on earth. It doesn't mean that everything goes easy. It doesn't mean that there's ups and downs. It doesn't even mean you achieve everything you want, though you may. Who knows? But the key thing, it's about being yourself and using what's best about you to help others. So that's a person's long-term objective. And then in life, people need long-term objectives. And when you have long-term objectives, those will help guide you from day to day. It will keep you going. I've been in this Black freedom struggle now for 61 years. It's kept me going because I see something way off, but at the same time, I'm applying it right now. And I'm working on day-to-day issues, but I'm spending more time on the future than on the present. And you only don't do it when you think you can't, because you can do whatever you decide to do. If you got one of those boring jobs where nobody's supervising you and the work's all over, then do your other work. Just don't get caught. But if you can't, do it after work. If work is not the place where you're fulfilling your Ka, your Ori, your destiny. So the long-term objective is extremely important. Now, in conceiving of this is much harder for us to do in the United States than it is for Africans in the Caribbean or in Africa. Why? Because in the Caribbean and Africa, you're a majority. And so it was very clear during the colonial era in the 50s, say in the Caribbean or in Africa in the 50s, it was very clear sooner or later, the majority of people in those countries would run those countries. And that would produce, or that would lead to political independence. So that was clear. But when you're in a situation like we're in, where the numbers are not on our side, where we're not the majority, then it's not as clear how we move forward. And as a result, when we hit 1965, after the objectives of the Southern Freedom Movement had been achieved, the right to vote and ending legal apartheid, it wasn't clear where we would go after that. And it's understandable why it wouldn't be clear. And in fact, there's an important book on the Mississippi freedom struggle called I've Got the Light of Freedom by an author named Charles Payne. I've referred to it before. It's a classic. He went and interviewed a lot of activists in the Mississippi freedom struggle. And one of the things he noted that when the movement was over, that is, the phase of the movement that was civil rights was over by 65, he noted that in Mississippi, which is the bowel of hell for Blacks in America, the majority of Blacks who had been active in the movement were no longer passing on resistance traditions. They were no longer passing those on. That doesn't mean none of them were, but a lot of them were not. And so I've often wondered why. And so the simple answer is they thought they were already free. They got the right to vote, the end of segregation. I don't think so, because if you look at Mississippi, there's no way in the world you could think you were free just because you could vote, because even then you had the right to vote, but exercising it was another thing. Look at what we're facing right now, you know? And while we ended segregation, we got the right to vote, we didn't end the stranglehold of white power in this country. I think the major reason some Blacks stopped passing this on is they didn't know what message to pass on. They didn't know that because it wasn't clear. I think that's the main reason. Because, you know, you're in a situation where you're not guaranteed that if you just move in a certain direction, you'll be running the country. No, it doesn't work like that. We're not the majority here. And even if we were, it wouldn't be easy, but at least you could see the end result. So this was a problem with 65 and on. And so there were disagreements in the Black movement, or what was the Black movement, over the proper direction. Some went in the direction of Black power. Some, like John Lewis, continued in the direction of civil rights. Some got a job and dropped out of the struggle. Some ended up in Vietnam. Some ended up in jail. Some ended up dead. But the majority ended up dead in the middle of the system because it wasn't clear where the next phase of the struggle was. And when people were saying freedom now, they weren't really defining what they meant by freedom now, and couldn't. I'm not complaining about that, because at that point it meant getting the right to vote. But obviously freedom is a lot more than a vote. So the divergences that occur after 65 are understandable. And those are divergences that still exist, because it's not clear to us exactly where this long-term struggle needs to go. So King tried to address this by addressing the issue of the poor. And that's why he moved into Chicago with his campaign to address the needs of the poor, and dividing part of his year into living in a rough life in Chicago, living with the people to understand their conditions. And I think that's a good thing, because he was trying now to address what the Southern movement had not addressed, which was the issues of the urban poor, which, by the way, was a Southern issue as well as a Northern issue. And so we also saw that the radicalized wings of the movement, the Black Power movement, entered the Black Power phase. And Malcolm was the real architect of that, though he was taken out before it was actually uttered. So there was an attempt to address the issues of urban poverty by one wing of the movement, in this case, King's wing. And I must say, and I don't like saying this, but I think that while King had the understanding of the overall need for restructuring the society, he was correctly focused on addressing the issues of the poor. And he lived a simple life that expressed that. And he took a principled stand against the war in Vietnam. I do not think that King was equipped to handle this next phase. And King said so himself. He said he had not been trained to build power. And that was an honest statement. And so while he was trying to learn how to do that, I think that the methods that had worked in the South were largely not workable in the North. That is the march, which was a technique. Now, Black Lives Matter has used the march effectively, but Black Lives Matter itself is caught in a contradiction. And it is that while this has built a great movement for them around the rage against police violence, and you've seen this victory that has just recently occurred in court. It took a world movement to get one cop undercharged, a world movement. So while this march is an effective thing for riling our people up and moving them into motion, when it comes to addressing police violence, at least putting it on the agenda, the reality is a movement that's focused purely on the police can only go so far. Because please believe me, as long as this system exists, the police will be here. And we can talk about reforming it, and I think it's good that Black Lives Matter and other groups are, but there's a limit to what you can accomplish with that. You'd better place your main emphasis on building real power among Black people. And I think some wings in Black Lives Matter realize that, and some of them are doing that. But I'm saying that while the march has had some limited application in the North, in this case around police violence, largely that tactic was not a tactic that was going to be workable in addressing poverty in the North or in the South. Because it's one thing to have a Bull Connor who's unleashing dogs and fire hoses on you, and that gets you a civil rights bill. And it's another thing to have a Raymond Pettis Bridge incident where demonstrators in their move from Selma to Montgomery for voter rights are beaten down. And that generates sympathy that gets you a voter rights bill. As I pointed out, I was a March Marshal on that march, got arrested on that march. So that's one thing. But when you're addressing inner city poverty, the inequalities of distribution of wealth and power, that ain't enough. You know what I mean? So I think that we've entered a period where we're going to have a better understanding of how we build power. And intimately tied to that is, what's your long-term objective? And then what are we doing on a day-to-day basis? And that long-term objective is what gives you hope. Because a lot of our people, particularly our young people, some of them are lacking hope right now. And they need to see it's in a future while we're addressing it and applying it right now. So King and Malcolm had both agreed that the country needed to be restructured. A system designed to enable a few to profit from it is not going to be the system that's going to produce prosperity for the many. But what King and Malcolm couldn't predict was that by 1968, other things would happen in the Black community that would require changes. King would be taken out on the eve of those shifts. Malcolm was taken out 3 years before them. But these shifts that I've discussed before, where powerful hostile forces hit Black communities and lead to a choice between two cultures, the drug traffic, breakdown of Black families, extended family communities, and so forth. These were forces that they could not predict. And these conditions called for a different approach to leadership. No longer is the single charismatic leadership the kind of leadership that will take us forward. We need group-centered leadership. The Ella Baker model is better, and we need to even improve on that model, because real power, if we're going to build it among our people and among the poor, is among the people. The people have the power. Some people have expressed a desire on this show to understand how the power structure in this country works. And that's part of what I plan to do with this show. I've established a leadership training program that I'll be operating on this YouTube show. It's called P.A.P.O, which P.A.P.O is the name for the highest university system in ancient Kemet. P.A.P.O meant house of life. P.A.P.O, house of life, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Leadership Institute. As I pointed out before, you see behind me all the time, Amilcar Cabral, the greatest leader in the 20th century, who underwent the transformations that this show recommends that you work on, described through the sixfold stages to mental freedom, as Malcolm did, as a number of other of our people have, that this leadership training institute is drawing from the leadership overall methodologies of Cabral and Ella Baker, as well as those that many of us in the Black Freedom Movement have worked out over time, and drawing from the history and culture of our people. So for those that want to know how the society works, that's going to be through this training, as well as knowing our history, knowing our culture, both African and African American. So this is also a part of what we'll be drawing from. So I decided when I retired, I never planned to retire. I enjoyed teaching, and I thought it would never happen. But then I decided that I would, and the reason was that I wanted to devote more time to organizing. And once I got into that, I decided I wanted to use my skills to aid in training. So that's going to be a part of what we're doing here. So the forces that hit us since '68 have put our communities, as I pointed out before, in the position of choosing between two cultures. And so the book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures, addresses that. So anything we address in our community better address our culture, both African and African American, and it needs to be tied to political, social, economic issues, family issues, issues of abuse, the issues that a lot of our good workers are doing. I see Sister Janae Johnson's just joined us, and this is the work she's doing with young sisters. She's doing some real beautiful work, and I'm going to be asking this beautiful sister to be on my show. And I mean, she is physically beautiful, but more important, spiritually. She's got a good spirit. And there are a lot of folks in our community doing this kind of work. And so this topic for today, the key that unlocks the door to just societies, is addressing this. And so what we see is Black youth born between 65 and 84 faced a set of circumstances different from those that my generation faced, similar but different, and in many ways worse, and in some ways better. They come into a world where the legal apartheid system has been put down, even though you still got the mythology of white supremacy, the mythology, racism still being practiced, and all the rest of this. They are entering a situation where life circumstances are more difficult. While their parents, and you can consider me of that generation, of the parents, had benefited from World War II. And so many of them, and my father, for example, could get a job. My father had no education. He was self-educated, one of the smartest people I ever knew, because he didn't have to overcome all that brainwashing, you know? And so my father could get a good job as a longshoreman, you know, take care of a family, get him a new car every 3 years. That was his luxury. He liked to drive those big Buicks. They're pretty. In fact, I remember when I was being raised in the Fillmore, because I lived in the Fillmore for 7 years, I got into one of those cars and got it going down the hill. And I was only about 5 years old and ran into a telephone pole and got my butt whipped for it. You know, but someone like my father could support a family on that. My mother could stay home and raise the children, even though she preferred to run her own business, which she ended up doing later, her own school. So there was industrial work that Black people finally got into as a result of World War II. As Malcolm said, Tojo did more to produce some economic opportunities for Black folks than the system did, meaning World War II did. After A. Philip Randolph threatened to march on Washington because they had hired everybody in the factories. And it's only when he threatens a march on Washington that Roosevelt's issue an FEPC order, Fair Employment Practices Commission order, saying you gotta hire Blacks, only then. But the point is those opportunities began to open up. And later, Black people got an opportunity to buy homes, so it took a while for that to happen. But by the 1980s and 1990s, when the children of my, that come after me, the hip hop generation entered the job market, they were faced with a different set of circumstances: falling wages, worsening working conditions for unskilled workers because they weren't getting paid that much. And King saw that with automation and cybernation. They were taking jobs away. Not only did jobs leave the country through deindustrialization, automation was taking jobs away. And the youth who entered the job market in the 80s and 90s, they're coming in at a time where the greatest disparities between rich and poor is taking place in this country, and where one of the dumbest presidents in the history of America, who could hardly chew bubble gum and think and walk at the same time, Ronald Reagan was in office, and he brought poverty back to America roaring, ending unions, supporting neoliberalism, which means taking everything almost that the government had and privatizing it. They get a chance, they want to do that with the last vestige of a social program that people have until now, this $6 trillion set of programs that Biden has, which people need to take a close look at and take advantage of. The aim has been the moderate Democrats and the Republicans almost totally to eliminate your last social gain of the Roosevelt New Deal era, Social Security. So our youth enters the job market during this particular time. So in the 80s, when you have hip hop as a strong kind of cultural expression coming from the youth, the top 1% in the United States, which represented 843,000 households, had a net worth of $4.8 trillion, according to the Federal Reserve. Between the 70s and the 80s, the top 1% enjoyed the greatest growth in family incomes. This was largely due to Reagan's neoliberalism. It was due to cutting the taxes on the rich, because under Roosevelt, the rich had been required to pay 90% above a certain income level. That financed all kinds of programs. And up until Reagan, you had free college education. I went to college, $100 a year. You understand? Went to law school, $100 a year. And now you got to go in debt for the rest of your life, because under neoliberalism, then education's been treated as a commodity when it should be a right. Everybody should have a right to an education. Biden's now talking about making junior colleges free. It should all be free, because your tax dollars are already paying for it. Good part of Europe, they don't have to pay this, So Reagan also bust unions. And when you bust unions, then you bring people down to the poverty level. And so what we see is during this period, there was a 70% growth in the income of the top 1%. Today, in 2020, 1% of US households own the wealth that 90% of Americans own. In other words, 1% own as much as 90%. You hear me? In fact, more than 90%. And so when we ask, then why do we see a lot of youth not seeing any future for them? Around them, they don't see a future, because around them, they don't see the example of Black men who've got, or Black women, got viable jobs that can support families. Our families now are at 29% two-parent household. For 100 years, 75% two-parent households. No finance, no romance. When the finance goes out, it's very hard to sustain the romance. Or you do it for a temporary period of time. Or as one of my students said, you rent you a man. She wants to have a good weekend, she rents her a man. You know what I mean? In other words, she'd like to have her a man in her life every day of her life, but it's kind of hard now. Most men feel like they're being priced out. And so this is the nature of it. And so if we look at this, and this is why King and Malcolm was saying that this needs to be restructured. Do you get it? When almost all the wealth's in the hands of just a handful of people, it means there's nothing left for everybody else. So then if we look at the racial income gap, then we also know, because I'm doing this to lay the foundation for why restructuring is necessary, why we need keys to just societies. And these are just inarguable facts, because we're often blaming the victim. Oh, Black people only did this, if we only did that. If we set up our own businesses, which we need to do more of, but I'm going to discuss that one in a minute too. So if we look at the white-Black income gap and the white-Black wealth gap, then let's look at the fact that as a whole, whites control 85% of the nation's wealth. Now notice most of that's in the hands of very few. Blacks control 4.1% of the nation's wealth. The median net worth of Black households, and this is dealing with your overall wealth, and this is usually measured by your wealth in housing, because for the average person, it's the equity you have, that is whatever you owe on the house, the value above that, that is really the measure of the average person's wealth. The median net worth for white households is $171,000. The median net worth for Black households is $17,150. So there's some reasons for that, but the key point is we're always looking at that gap, which is the gap between whites and Blacks. So you can see that there's a 10-time greater concentration of wealth in the hands of whites than Blacks. But that isn't the real gap. It's the gap between the rich and the poor. Now that is the real gap. And that gap makes all these other gaps want you to do some slapping. Right? That's a slap gap. You know what I'm talking about? So then if we ask why, because I'm getting into the keys for just societies, I'm laying a case. I did go to law school, you know, I decided I want to be no lawyer because I figured I could win in the streets better. I could kick corporations behind quicker than getting a jury to vote for me, you know what I mean? Or my client. But the key point is, if you ask, why has Black wealth disparities become so great? The answers are multiple. 246 years of free labor, that's the first reason. We got 246 years where we built the country and didn't get anything for it. And of course, the movement for reparations is designed to demand correction on this. This is a global movement, and it's righteous and it's correct. And I'm going to tell you something. For the most part, you ain't getting it until you have the power. On a local level, you may get a little. So build your power if you want some reparations, and then be clear what you're going to put it into. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, during post-Reconstruction and Reconstruction, 61,144 Black people invested $3 million in the Freedmen's Savings Bank. $3 million was a whole lot of money then, a whole lot of money then. And Frederick Douglass was brought in to try and even rescue this bank. But by 1874, Blacks lost all their money, and it was through white mismanagement and theft. And Blacks were not given a penny back. And at that time, banks didn't insure deposits to begin with. That didn't happen until the FDIC occurred during the Roosevelt New Deal administration. But then who cared about what Black people lost? And so that was wealth down the drain. Part of the reason for lynchings was to take Black wealth. You hang somebody by a tree and take what they got, or just simply go on their land and tell them, get the hell out of here by midnight, or we're killing you, raping your wife, and taking what you got. And so a lot of Black wealth was stolen through violence. And by the way, Black prosperity has been a crime in this country. How many people have told you about being on a job and you come into the job in a new Cadillac and your boss is looking at you like, where'd you get the money for this Cadillac? Don't come in with a Mercedes. You know what I mean? Huh? Because Blacks are supposed to be poor. And yeah, you're working a poor job, but some Blacks know how to save those pennies and make them work. So Black prosperity has generally been considered to be a crime in this country. And the best example is the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, when that community was bombed. And when whites came in and violently attacked Blacks, Blacks fought back. But that community was torn down. 10,000 Black people lived there. That was the most prosperous Black community in the United States and one of the most prosperous ones, period, in the country. Now, what most of you don't know is Blacks rebuilt Greenwood. You don't know that. Some do, most don't. And what most don't know, because I've been to Greenwood, is that later, this was, I think, late 70s, the white power structure had a plan to run a freeway through that Greenwood district. And they promised the Black community that they would relocate their businesses and their homes into another community. And they ran the freeway through and they didn't relocate nothing. And so it was in this case, urban renewal that wiped out what was left of the Greenwood Black community. Further causes of Black wealth disparities are obviously the Black codes during Reconstruction, in which you were strung out on sharecropping, where you didn't make hardly any money. And the GI Bill, when it was passed, the GI Bill didn't apply in the South. Southerners saw to that. If you were living in the South, you didn't get the benefits of the GI Bill. Nor did you get the benefits of Social Security, because it exempted from Social Security the kinds of work that Blacks did, particularly Black women, household work and other kinds of work, as well as sharecropping work. And so for some time, Social Security was denied to, that's accumulation of income. That's also enabling you to have a cushion for your later years in life. And for a long time, we know that Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the ways in which the federal government insured mortgages, were denied to Blacks. And so it took us a long time to get into accumulating housing, which is the main basis for wealth for everyday people in this country, and is still one of the best investments. You increase your investment by at least 6% a year if you're owning a house. You can do the stock market and make more, and you can lose more too. You can lose on housing too, but it's not that usual for that to happen. So all of this, along with the fact that if you have been denied the ways to accumulate wealth, then what ends up happening is when it comes to passing on wealth, you have less to pass on. And so the Republicans recently have put such a low cap on inheritance taxes, you don't have to hardly pay any. But even if you did, Blacks have so little to pass on that most of us aren't going to get much, if anything. And if we do, it comes through real estate. And then it only comes if you're wise enough to set up a revocable trust, something I set up for my mother at her request. She said she was ill at one point. She's in her bed and she raised her finger up and she said to me, we're both Leos, you know, she said, you are my strategist. My mother's very precise with her English, meaning strategist. I said, yeah, Mom, okay, I'll handle that. So some of us, now when we get some property, we're selling it right away. That's with the youth, a lot of the youth, you know, you don't sell property, keep it. You know what I mean? Pass it on to your family, you know, and then that's a way, you know, you accumulate some wealth. And then when we get some housing, then 2008 comes along with those bad mortgages and the failure of your Black president to rescue you when he had over $30 billion to rescue, then you lost 40% of your housing wealth. And today with COVID-19, you've lost 40% of your businesses because those loans didn't go to us as much. So these are all reasons why we find the structure of America produces poverty, and then it produces extreme poverty for us. And all the more reason why we have to begin to look at both the short-term solution, which is how do we restructure this society so that we can eliminate this, and particularly the long-term solution, and the short-term solution that addresses day-to-day issues that we have to fight for. And I want to say that the stuff that Biden's doing right now, you put him in the White House. Some of you aren't even interested in exploring that. I did a whole show on how we led the move to whip Trump, put him out of the White House and put him in the jailhouse, or prepare him for the jailhouse. He's getting prepared for that right now. And I find very little interest in people even looking at that. That tells me you're underestimating your own power. Don't you want to know how you did it? You know, without that Black Lives Matter movement, without COVID-19, Trump would still be in the White House with those 4 to 5 million extra white voters he got, even more white women the second time, when he had done more damage to them the second time around than the first time around, because he was the white president. But you out-Blackanized him, out-organized him, out-allianced him, out-issue organized him. And then you went and took back the Senate. You did that. So take advantage of it. Whatever critiques you have of Biden, put your foot up his butt. But it's $6 trillion he's getting ready to try and spend. And for the first time, a substantial amount's going to be on poor people. So make sure you're getting some of that. And that's part of short range stuff, to rebuild those businesses and strengthen families and retool the school skills of Black youth, especially Black males, all of whom are not going to go to college, but who need technical skills, whether it is as electricians or plumbers or builders or whatever. A lot of those jobs will produce more money than a college education. Everybody ain't going to college. Take advantage of that. That's short term. There's a lot more. Today is focused more on the long term than the short term, but I went through all of this woe is me stuff on why we're in the situation where, to stress the fact the system's structured that way. You got a vulturistic system. It's designed this way. It's not because you're irresponsible that you're poor. You're under semi-colonial oppression. The police, it's not a matter of there's some good cops, but it's just the bad cops that are doing you in. Policing is bad. It's designed that way. It's designed to keep you under control. The police are an occupying army in your community for a reason. If these people are getting more and more and you're getting less and less, they figure they better clamp down on you before you do something about it. And you have started to do something about it. So this issue on restructuring, we need to understand that major reason is it putting us in a bind where we have less and less and they got more and more. And we got to do something about it. Now, a lot of us, and particularly our youth, their dreams have got confined to two dreams. Now, I'm going to say this, a lot of our youth are not in this because we got more youth in college than in prison. And many of those in college, they have a lot of dreams and they're trying to fulfill it. But the average youth that ain't going to college is often caught between Jay-Z dreams and King James dreams. And the rapper, the notorious B.I.G., some people ask, why are you using him? He was a gangster rapper. Well, it's a little bit more complex than that. He had some bad lyrics, and his lyrics summarized a lot of stuff going on. And he was also caught in a bind. He was one of those young Black males and females who was very smart and didn't see much out there for him. Had a good mother, Jamaican woman, had his foot in both worlds, the African-American community, the Jamaican community, and his talent came from both places. But if you read his lyrics, they say something. And in fact, my generation wasn't in the bind that his was in, you know? And this is the dreams that he was caught between, what you could call a dream and a nightmare. And this affected generations of youth. It's what I call a choice between two cultures, when they dropped the drugs in the Black community, when they took the jobs out, when they busted up Black families, even though his was still there, you know? He was being influenced by what was going on the outside. He was being influenced by the desire to get some quick money. And so this is his description of the reality that the youth faced and still face. But it's a reality when you got a sense of a long-term objective and then short-term programs to address them, you can handle. He said, if I wasn't in the rap game, I'd probably be or have been knee-deep in the crack game, because the streets is a short stop. Either you're slinging crack rock or you got a wicked jump shot. We got a whole lot of Black youth that think that their only way out is to be a good rapper or to be able to dribble a basketball or to play some kind of sports, to be a King James or to have a good Curry long shot. The long shot against that is kind of like winning the slot machine in Vegas. When I go to Vegas, I don't spend any more than 25 cents on the slot machines. Later for that. You ain't gonna make nothing off the slot machines. They're gonna make money off of you. And America's like a slot machine. You know, if this is how you think you're gonna make it, I don't think so. So unless you wanna take the short stop to jail or death, or think you have a wicked jump shot or a Steph Curry long shot, it's best that you look at how you change this situation so that you can face and your children can face a situation of liberation. It's better that you look at what can you do to exercise your power, to change things, to better them for yourself and for your people. What can you do to discipline your mind so that you can free your behind, so that you can transcend the system? Remember, Malcolm was in the mud, but Malcolm came out of the mud. He rose above it because he underwent a psychological identity transformation, and he became one disciplined, serious, loving brother. So when King thought about restructuring the economy, he reached the right conclusion that capitalism is no good. Capitalism was built on free labor, the free labor of Blacks, the genocide of Native Americans, the theft of half of Mexico. And now the people whose land was stolen from them and have had trade agreements imposed on them, who now don't have their land anymore because Bill Clinton's NAFTA took away their communal sharing rights to land. They end up coming across the border, which they'd much rather stay in Mexico and they get called aliens. But at the same time, half of Mexico was theirs and ripped off from them, and they don't see the border the same way that the whites see it. So when King thought of economic restructuring, King was looking at Sweden and other European countries, and he was thinking about the Roosevelt New Deal model. Malcolm was looking at Ujamaa villages in Tanzania, meeting with Nyerere and others, and thinking about the ways in which Africans were handling this. One main reason that I'm doing this show is that I want to reach a new audience. I'm tired of doing what a lot of people in my generation do, talk to the choir, talk to the same people. I want to reach a larger audience. And I want to talk about the future. And especially I want to reach young folks, because you're the future. And some of you are engaged in struggle already, so we can have a dialogue and an exchange. But you're the future. So I want to be able to have the opportunity to get you to think about tomorrow as well as today. So it's clear, the future belongs to those who plan for it and prepare for it. My writings and the writings of a number of African-centered scholars and conscious scholars, whether they're African-centered or not, focus on addressing both the present and the future. And we're in a historical period that favors us. Power is shifting. In the world, it's shifting away from the United States to the east, to China. By 2040, 44, China is going to be the leading global power. And it's shifting away from whites in this country. And that's why you had this big reaction to this immigration movement, the movement of a large number of Chicanos, and the shift of population to black, brown, red, and yellow, and the election of Trump. And that's also why Trump got whipped. Because while whites are still larger in number, they are declining number, and by 2044 or so, they will be a minority number. They are already a minority in this state, which is the largest state in the United States. So this shift in power is the backdrop for why we need to be thinking about what kind of society do we want this to be? Because we weren't at the table when they wrote this Constitution. We weren't included as human beings when this Constitution was written. And so we have to really think about what kind of society do we want our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to live in? And for African people, Africans in America, Blacks, if you're Black, you're African. You may not know it, but you have come into a society and you have brought into this society a culture that you recreated in enslavement, but has an African foundation. And that is going to play a leading role in where America goes in the future, just as the best of Latino and Native American culture is going to do the same thing. But ours is going to play a leading role because the culture we forged out of enslavement is a culture of popular choice of the United States and of the world. And the art form that we shaped out of that is the art form of popular choice of the United States and the world. And it is these two things that bring beauty and hope to humanity. And we're strongest when we draw from the best of the African part of that now, as well as appreciating the African-American component, which too many Blacks in this country do not appreciate. We need an African-American or new African cultural renaissance where we do as we did in the 80s, and we appraised ancient Kemet and saw its value. We need to continue to do that and draw from the rich culture of ancient Africa while we look at the wealth of creativity and beauty that we have created in this country. We need to assess that. We need a new African or African-American cultural renaissance so that we can draw from the best of our past, discard the mess, because we know we've got plenty of this slave garbage that needs to be thrown out, and this post-68 gangster drug culture stuff that needs to go. But our culture is able to handle that, combined with building some real power. So this show is dedicated to drawing from our past. We've looked at drawing from the powers of God that reside within us. We've looked at Black movements in this country, particularly Black leaders who have played a particular role. We've looked at self-defense traditions that come out of the Black freedom movements of the 60s and before, coming out of Africa. And we're going to be looking at ancient Africa. We're going to be looking at the deep thought of our people. We're going to be looking at the culture of our people. But all of it's about bringing about change in our lives. I'm practical. So this emphasis today on keys to unlocking, the keys for the just society, this is looking at how can we apply the past to the present to make it useful so that we have a strong future. So when we study African-American history and culture, it is this culture that inspired the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor movement. It's this culture that inspired the Black freedom movements of the 60s and the Black Power movements. Because liberation movements at their highest levels are the highest expression of a people's culture, because when people dedicate themselves to something bigger than themselves, then what you find is the best of the culture emerges. And in fact, cultures grow through movements for liberation. The Haitian Revolution, Desalegn, when he came to power, the greatest of the Haitian leaders, and the only movement against slavery in the history of the world where the slaves overthrew slavery. It was Desalegn. When he came to power, he enunciated three things. One, if you had a drop of Black blood in you and you were a Haitian, you're Black. Two, only Blacks could own land in Haiti, and land was the basis for wealth. And this was the one where, because he joined a movement that was greater than himself and rose above himself, he was able to take the culture and transcend it and raise it to a higher level. And he issued a rule that the land of Haiti shouldn't just be shared. That's communalism. But it should be equitably shared, meaning no one should have more and no one should have less. In other words, he improved on the culture. He improved on it, because in joining the people, he underwent a transformation and he transcended himself, because that's what we're here for. We're here to do something for humanity, for our people, not just for ourselves. And in that we grow. That's been my greatest reward, is what I've learned in the movement from everyday Black folks. Those are the ones that have been my real teachers. And so it's the growth that you get out of serving a cause greater than yourself that is the most important thing. And so it's the growth that we've seen with young people who took to the streets behind the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and a host of other Floyds and Taylors who have been snuffed out by the police, that we've seen a growth in the consciousness of our youth and a commitment to something stronger. And that's been an act of culture. So when we draw on the long-range question of restructuring this country or creating a just society, and by the way, it's not just this country, this is the world. Africa is facing the same issue. The Caribbean is facing the same issue. Blacks, wherever they are in the world, are facing unjust systems. So I'm not just talking about the United States. This is global. And in fact, the vision for a just society is one that comes out of our culture, but it is one that has application to people all over the world. So when we talk about having the keys to the just society, unlocking the door to the just society, then we have to draw from the past and use it in the present, and be particularly concerned about what can we learn about our past, about how we constructed societies that prevented the unequal distribution of wealth and the unequal distribution of power. And it is from that study, the study of history, that, as Malcolm said, of all studies is best designed to reward your research, that you get your best answers. And because we live in the US of A, United States of amnesia, this is a place that places little value on history. For us, because of enslavement. For whites, because of the mythology of America, the land of great opportunity. It's a land of genocide. Hitler based his society on America. And in fact, Hitler was a saint compared to America, because his project worked for 5 or 6 years. He killed 6 million Jews, some gypsies and others, and that was terrible. But when you have a couple of 100 years of genocide carried out against the native people of this country, that's far worse. And that's why he looked at this as a model. He was looking for a good model for savagery. And so you should know what you're up against. And so you're taking your Africa. For those of you who are coming out of this Mexican thing, you're taking that Indian stuff, you know what I mean? Which is the best of your Mexican stuff. You hear me? And it's with Native Americans, they already have a basis for models for just society coming out of the Iroquois Confederacy and others. But ours is fundamental. And so we need to be drawing from our past, and this is what this show will be spending a lot of time on, is your history, but to apply it to produce change in your life today and tomorrow. Now, my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, this book provides the key to just societies. And it came to me through God's beautiful light. I discussed my experience of the beautiful light when we were dealing with the God Within series and how it changed me. Sister Janae Johnson, I don't know if she's still on, but I made the comment that she was one of the people that observed the changes that had occurred to me after I underwent that transformation. And it is from that experience and the work that I did to be granted that opportunity to have the insight of the beautiful light that I was able to gain the paradigm or model for just societies, for just families, for just extended families, for just communities. Because to change society, you first have to change yourself, and then your families and your communities. So the God Within series went into the ultimate powers that reside inside of each of us, which is the God within. That when you draw from these, you move from victimhood to a position where your thoughts govern your reality, when your thoughts are positive. And so your thoughts materialize into action, materialize into a better life. And so we have this capacity to produce change. And the last of the God Within series, I discussed the Dogon conception of God, which is summarized in their term adunoso, A-D-U-N-O-S-O, aduno, aduno, universe, so knowledge, knowledge of the universe, or it can mean wisdom of the universe. And I pointed out that the Dogon are master astrophysicists. And so they call their deepest thought deep knowledge, which is astrophysics. But unlike the astrophysics of the West, which is material bodies in space, they see how that astrophysics applies to each human being, how the cosmos that's outside is within. We're the miniature cosmos of this larger cosmos. And I made the point when I went through that series of how astrophysicists have concluded, after studying over 170,000 stars, that the human being is nothing but stellar dust. The Kemites already knew that. I made the point that that's why they described a human being as Seba, or a star. That was the name for a student, a five-pointed geometric figure that looks like a human being, meaning that inside of you is the light of God. That's a star. And inside of that are your gifts and your powers and everything else. But on the Adunoso point from the Dogon, I was really stressing a very powerful point that they have, and it is this idea that God created the cosmos, and they said 10 cosmoses, which means many cosmoses. And many astrophysicists believe that there's more than one. We don't have proof of it, but they believe that, and the Dogon do as well. And what the Dogon said was that Ama, which is their name for God, A-M-M-A, Ama created the cosmos through Ama's mind, through thought. And I made the point that Adunoso also means catch, meaning God's mind catches, meaning it's alive, meaning when God thinks, God brings into being what God thinks. Well, that's how it works with human beings. As you think, so you are. And so when we're talking about creating just societies, whatever someone could create that's unjust, you have the capacity to create what's just. And in fact, you have 144,000 years of history to prove that if you bothered to study any of it. So when we believe that we have this capacity to create something better, and many of us are doing that in our lives, we see that. And so we are creating realities. We are creating realities. It's often not acknowledged because you're looking at TV for it. No, it's in your community. Check around you. And so while the world is living on $2 a day, and my friend, Dr. Asa Hilliard, who's passed on, said he was in parts of Africa where people were eating mud, the richest continent on the planet, where a few have everything, and particularly the few in this country, and then their leaders who are getting the crumbs off the table, but it's more than the people have. So we have a world in which the majority of people are living in misery because most everything has been grabbed by a very few. If you could live in a society for 100,000 years where that wasn't the case, and that was the case in Africa, where you didn't have poverty 100,000 years, you don't think you can recreate that again. That's called mental incarceration. They put your mind in prison, put it behind bars. And then even when they let you out, you still act like your mind is under lockdown. It's under chains, it's under bars. But when you free your mind, you will see that you can make your reality what you want it to be. You hear me? And so when we're talking about creating a model for just society, or the keys to just society, I'm drawing from the vision of this beautiful light that came from God's beautiful light that came through me, but it wasn't for me. It's for humanity. It's for my people, but it's for humanity. And I cannot lie and say I was so smart, I got this on my own. No, it came through me. And anytime you draw from something like this, then you're going to find that what you're getting is even more than you even realize at the time, because I had this experience of the light in 1990. And since then, I've come to see more and more of God's beautiful light. So the key to just families, just communities, and just societies are keys that apply to your life today. I'm living that in my marriage, in my family. I'm dedicating this show to a family, the Levine family, that practices this. And there's a lot of others that do. And it'll work whether you're in a family or not, because I know a lot of you aren't in families. So you're saying, oh, this doesn't apply to me, or I'm in a committed relationship. Or as one sister I was getting into on Facebook yesterday, she said, I'm in a complicated relationship. This was a sister from the continent. I said, okay, I think I know what you're talking about. So the issue of the key to just societies is an issue that involves restoring balance to the family. It involves restoring balance in terms of how an economy works. And it involves having some faith in your people and examining how that worked. Because one reason why Europe has not been able to provide this kind of vision is their societies have never been based on sharing societies. They have not. And so when Marx critiqued capitalism, he couldn't come up with an alternative out of his own culture because he didn't have one. You do. So why aren't you digging in it? And this is the real key for the vision for just societies. But you'll see digging in it's not enough, because if you don't get some help, sometimes you don't even know what you're looking at. And that was the case with me. So I'd explained before that in coming up with or experiencing this beautiful light, I had gone through 15 months of retreats, 3 months, a year for 5 years, to look at my spiritual imbalance. And that was the imbalance of the masculine, strong on the masculine, but weak on the feminine. And to deal with the keys to just societies, we're all going to have to work on our imbalances. We all have our own. With a lot of men, it's the same as mine, strength on the masculine, weak on the feminine. But with a lot of Black men, they have that one handled, and it may be other things. Because we find, when I had Dr. Siri McDougall on my show for 3 shows where he dealt with his research on Black masculinity, he showed that when you look at Black men, a lot of Black men define Black manhood as not just being physically supportive of their mates, but emotionally supportive. And while a lot are not, there are a lot who are. And that's usually a key to real good Black manhood. My father had that quality, He was a man's man and a ladies' man. He didn't play around. I asked him once, did he play around when he was young? He said he didn't have any time. He worked 2 jobs, but that ain't what he meant. He loved my mother so much, he had no interest in playing around. You know what I mean? But the key point is he had a sensitivity. My father did. But he was one of the baddest Black men I ever saw, taking the heads off the Klan when he was 12 years old. I've told you about that before. Absolutely fearless when it came to anything white. You know what I mean? Refused to fight in World War II because he knew where his battlefield was. It surely wasn't in Germany or Japan. He knew that, So the vision for the just society I'm going to share with you, it ain't just some formula and, oh, here's the formula. Oh, that's it. No, it's something that's got to come from inside of you, because you can't change the society until you change yourself. And we've all got stuff that we have to work on. So billions of people across the world hunger for justice, hunger for food, if you want to get straight. And right now in India, for air. And Africa, if we don't see that these COVID medicines get to them, Africa could find themselves in a similar situation, though some are managing this better than other parts of the world, particularly the Caribbean, because some of their leaders have some concern for them, especially in the Caribbean. But the point is, people are hurting on the planet. And justice is what people need more than anything, not what Rat Brown talked about when he talked about the American system just iced. That's what they've been getting. And some of them have been identifying with the ice. I see all these Facebook friends that I'm befriending, and I see a lot of them coming out of Africa with stacks of dollars all over the place. This is their hope. I'm not going to say which country this is. Almost all the time when I see stacks of dollars, I know which country this is. I'm not going to say it because it'll sound like I'm putting a country down. But the fact is, yeah, we need some money. We need some finance. That will help our romance, but money won't love you. It's a lot more than money. But that is one of the things we're talking about, economic restructuring that will improve the conditions of people so that they'll have a roof over their head, enough to eat, clothes on their back, good health care, and ability to send their kids to school, good schools. So ending the abuse of women is real key. If we're talking about creating just societies, this is fundamental. If this isn't on the top of the agenda, then I don't care what you do with economic restructuring. If you have the same abuse in families that you had before, then it's not going to really matter. Ask the sister who's being beat down or raped. And so that's something we can address right now and need to address. But also, as we take the models for just society and apply it in our day-to-day living, we'll find that this is also the basis for pushing this out the door and seeing that this kind of behavior ends. So what I really want to stress more than anything as a basis for just societies, the vision that comes from God, is the vision that comes from God has no holes in it, no error. The error is me, and could be my interpretation or you. But what God offers, generally, no error. And it's beauty. And it works. And it's multifaceted because, as I pointed out before, God's mind is whole. It's not linear. It's like a spiral. There are many sides when God gives you an answer to a problem. And so for me, the vision for the just society came after over 30 years of successful battles for Black freedom, Black power. And it came from a number of years of working on internal imbalances, and it came after an awakening, that sixfold stages. It came through that. It came through transformation. So this isn't just something that, oh, I just suddenly, this is the key to just societies. Oh, here it is. No, some hard work, but it wasn't for me alone. It's for humanity. And I think God only shares the light when God knows it's going to be used for more than personal benefit. So what I'm going to drop on you, the vision for just societies, completed an imbalance within me. But it did so after a lot of internal work. And so what I'm suggesting that is, if we're going to restructure society as King and Malcolm called for, and many of our people in humanity want done, then we got to work on restructuring ourselves in ways unique to our own particular imbalances and our own needs. My imbalance was the feminine. I had to work on that. Each of you have to look at, where are your imbalances? What do you have to work on? And it's a question of internalization or being what we're talking, living what we're learning. And that is by cultivating the God within us and cultivating our own sense of identity. And out of this comes a deep sense of self-love that enables us to love others. And a part of this is through cultivating our identities. The sixfold stages helps with that. And a part of that is through knowing our destiny and our purpose and trying to fulfill that. Now, what I'm going to share with you isn't new. See, most people think that innovation, I'm an innovator, comes from people coming up with something new. No, innovation is discovering what's already there, but it's something that hadn't been seen before. That's what innovation is. And innovation almost always requires the help of God because it takes God's mind for us to be able to see what is whole. We often miss it if we're just dealing with the lower mind, or we get part of it. So if we look at Einstein, Einstein didn't invent the theory of relativity. He discovered what was already there. And this discovery occurred after he had mastered the fundamentals of quantum physics, and he was an average physicist. So he wasn't alone in knowing the fundamental principles of quantum physics. But when you talk about quantum physics, you're talking about Einstein, theory of relativity, you know? So Einstein had what all the other physicists had, and he was an average student. And I don't know it's because he wasn't that smart. I think he wasn't that interested in German education. And that also got him out of Germany before Hitler could put him in the hot seat. You know, Einstein was a pretty nice human being. So he wasn't identifying with that goose-stepping Gestapo, you know, and he ended up from the frying pan into the fire in the United States. But at least he didn't get burned, if you know what I mean. And so Einstein had a dream. And then while talking to a couple of other quantum physicists, an intuitive breakthrough. And that dream and that intuitive breakthrough gave him the theory of relativity. I'm saying that to say that the vision for the just society, if it's going to work, it's got to have God in it. And if God's vision is in it, there's not going to be any holes in it. And it's something that will work, as the theory of relativity did. So he didn't invent this, but through hard work and the intervention of God, he discovered what was already there that no one else had discovered before. So it's a very easy formula to explain, but until Einstein explained it through God's intervention, no one knew it to explain it. In the area of chemistry, and by the way, I mentioned this before when I was chairing Black Studies at San Francisco State, I radicalized the discipline. And the main way was to put the spirit into it. And the main way to put the spirit into it was to introduce science. And I had a meeting with the head of the chemistry department, a Jewish American person. And I did what I rarely do with an opponent, is tell them how I was going to whip them. You don't, as a strategist, don't do that. You whip somebody and they never figure out how you're going to whip them. But in this one, it was so easy. I was going to tell them how. I brought to the meeting one of our faculty members, Grant Venerable, PhD in chemistry, University of Chicago, our brother. Now, University of Chicago is rated real high when it comes to universities. Now, usually Blacks that come out of it aren't worth 2 cents because they get so brainwashed. And we had Raymond Winbush on the show early on when we were dealing with ADOS. And Winbush got his PhD in psychology from the University of Chicago. I said, and he's very conscious. He wrote a book on reparations. I said, how did you how did you end up so conscious? Because most Blacks coming out of the University of Chicago are worthless. And then he named one person, Bobby Wright, who was like the leader in the field of Black psychology. He came up with the psychopathic racist personality to describe white people. So Bobby Wright gave him his education, kept him solid. But when I'm meeting with this head of chemistry, I'm telling him that, okay, we can teach chemistry. We're not really qualified to. We get a BA, a Bachelor of Arts. And chemistry, that comes through the science department. So how are you going to do this? And we don't have labs or anything. You know what I mean? How are you going to do this? So if all I have is Grant Venerable, I lose because they're going to say you're duplicating their courses. But I said, now I'm going to tell you why I'm in here. I am not a scientist. That is not one of my strengths. I am not even claiming that it is. But I'm going to tell you how we're going to beat you. And it is this. We're going to show that the way we teach chemistry, the way we teach biology, and the way we teach physics is different from how you teach it. You have a thing called energy in quantum physics, waves and particles. But you don't know what that is. You just call it energy. We call it a spirit, and we call this science a spirit science. And I'm going to beat you because I'm going to tell them we're not teaching science the same way you do. And as a matter of fact, we're teaching it right. Because you don't know what this energy is and don't want to know because you want to use this energy for control and power over nature and over the cosmos. And so he left the meeting and said, I'm not going to support you. But then he made this admission, and this is going to get into my next point. He said, I must admit that all the breakthroughs in science have come from the intuitive plane. Well, guess where the great breakthrough in chemistry came from? It came from a German chemist. His name was August Kekulé, Kekule. He was a German organic chemist, and he was the most prominent of the chemists in Europe, especially in theoretical chemistry. He was the principal founder of the theory of the chemical structure, and in particular, what's called the Kekulé structure in benzene. According to Kekulé, he discovered the ring structure of benzene. This was his big discovery, that the benzene structure, that it had a particular structure. He came up with this understanding of the structure of benzene. According to Kekulé, he discovered the ring structure of benzene by piping into God's mind through a dream. In a dream, he saw a snake eating its tail. August Kekulé didn't invent the most important discovery in theoretical chemistry. He discovered the benzene ring, which was like a snake eating its tail. And he discovered it because he knew the basic fundamentals of chemistry, theoretical chemistry, but he was also piping into God's mind. And so he discovered the ring structure of benzene. And he didn't invent it, it came through him. He had the knowledge of chemistry, and then through a dream coming from God, he discovered its structure. Most important breakthrough in theoretical chemistry. So again, I'm saying, I'm laying the foundation for just societies. If you got God in the formula, it's going to work, baby. You're going to have to figure it out. You're going to have to apply it. You're going to have to work on it on yourself. And please believe me, it will take some work, but it's beautiful work. You want to talk about getting close to God? Ain't nothing more just than God. George Washington Carver was the greatest scientist in the 20th century. And he's the greatest scientist. Einstein always said he was. And then he said George Washington Carver was second greatest. Henry Ford always said George Washington Carver was. Everyone else that knew anything about science said that George Washington Carver was. And by the way, again, I really want to get on the brothers and sisters who think they don't have a culture. Oh, really? How is it you have a brother who's an ex-slave, who comes out of enslavement in a place in which there weren't a whole lot of blacks, who was blacker than most blacks in their culture inside, who becomes the foremost scientist on the planet? Explain that. Your culture's deeper than you think. And a lot of us, we can find George Washington Carver to the peanut. Well, actually, and I mentioned this before, Carter said that the reason that he was able to do what he was able to do is, one, he had a gift for healing plants. He said a plant never died in his care. That was a gift he had. But he also said that he was able to pipe into God's mind, that it was God who really helped him with his breakthroughs. And we know, because I have the definitive biography of George Washington Carver, one where he dictated his life to a writer. There's a lot of books written on Carver, and you will not get the essence of George Washington Carver. This is George Washington Carver. And all the other books leave the spirit out because, you know, that's spooky for a lot of whites and some blacks. And so what he described was, he discovered the curative properties of plants by walking in the forest at 4 a.m. in the morning, and the plants talk to him. And we say, oh yeah, what is that? I've discussed this before, but what that is everything God created is spirit, and then it's matter if it's material. And so spirit is intelligent. Energy is intelligent. And all over the world, Native Americans and Africans communicate with plants. Just because they don't in the West, because everything's materialized, don't think that this is something unusual. But for George Washington Carver, this was a key to his ability to innovate. He called this thinking God's thoughts. And this came through communicating with plants. This came through dreams. And this came through George Washington Carver going into his self-made laboratory, because he would actually go to the junkyard and pull together a lot of the stuff that he used for research equipment. And again, early in the morning, he would go into his laboratory and pipe into God's mind. And he called this, he was going to do creative science. George Washington Carver discovered so many things in the area of science, you can't even count them. One of the things he did was to come up with this Egyptian blue paint. He called it Egyptian blue. Why? Because, as I said at the beginning of this show, he saw his science, and he was a singer. He was a musician. He played the accordion, and he was a painter. And his first passion was painting, and he painted plants. And he said his objective as a science was to bring beauty and replace ugliness with beauty. And his first objective was to serve his people. He got a blank check from Henry Ford, any price, because Ford could make 10 times what he'd make if he hired him. And George said, no, I don't want to do that because my people will not get credit from my work. That was half of it. But the other half of it is he wouldn't be working for his people. And he got paid nearly nothing at Tuskegee, you know? He wasn't there for the money. He was serving a cause greater than himself. But the key thing is, he was the greatest scientist in the 20th century because he knew botany, he knew chemistry, he knew basic science. But he was continuously piping into God's mind. And God was constantly giving him a stream of inventions, none of which was harmful to human beings. Saying that to say, Vision for just society comes from the same place. You hear me? No holes in it, no harm in it. And it's healing. And it's not something you have to wait 100 years from now. You can apply it right now. You hear me? John Coltrane. I'm finishing this book on Seba, and he's one of the masters I've studied. And it's not been an easy study of him, because when you're looking at a master musician, in this case, jazz musician, you're dealing with abstraction, music. And in this case, music that's being vocalized through a horn, through various saxophones, tenor, alto, and soprano. And so to get inside of him, to really understand what made him tick, done a lot of research on this brother. He's beautiful, beautiful brother, beautiful. Now, what's important about this man, who ended up being one of the greatest saxophone players in the history of not just that instrument, but of music, period, was that he started off an ordinary, average musician. He didn't have any special gifts except one, which is a gift that most Blacks have, the gift of rhythm. His music teacher, Miss Yoakum, noticed that, but she also saw his potential for greatness, because that's what good teachers see. She saw that if he continued to work on this, that he could become great. But most musicians saw nothing but average playing. Coltrane was so dedicated to his music that lunch breaks in school, he was playing his music. He went to bed sometimes with the saxophone around his neck. When he went shopping, he had the saxophone around his neck. He practiced 14 hours a day, in part because he didn't have a lot of inbred natural talent, but in part because it was the discipline that he had. And that's one of the two most important qualities I think you need in life: discipline and good character. Those two things will carry you through, and then you can draw on your other gifts. But as many a basketball player will display, who come in from college with great skills, end up being average. Why? They don't spend the time practicing. Look at King James, man. I mean, the guy was, what, 16 years into basketball? No serious injuries. Of course, he's got to have a good body and everything. But the point is constant practice, and then happens to be a good human being, and then happens to have a good family relationship, and then is looking out for issues bigger than himself. I got a lot of respect for that brother, a lot of respect for him. And has surrounded himself with Black people. A lot of Black people that didn't know how to manage money, but he saw the potential and helped them develop. And, they managed his money. That shows you something. Somebody who really believes in himself, loves himself. He basically Black. You hear me? That's Black culture right there. You hear me? So Coltrane was an average musician. It took him until his 30s to become an improviser. Most improvisers were, Miles and the rest of them, Dizzy, in their early 20s, teenagers. They're improvising and innovating at an early age, coming up with new music. Coltrane, it wasn't until his 30s. So it took practice. Coltrane apprenticed under masters, which, by the way, the book I'm working on now, we're going to be using that in this show. The Dogon and African American mastery system. 3 levels in the African American system, 4 in the Dogon, they're the same. And the book that I'm finishing now, the greatest emphasis is on the masters. I'm looking at various masters in different walks of life. So Coltrane had apprenticed. He had done practice, but he was held up, as a lot of people know, by 2 things: drug addiction and alcohol. And it reached a point where it stopped him from playing. And this is what usually will lead a person who's an alcoholic or a drug addict to get off of it. Usually it's the loss of something. And it can be the near loss of your life, Some people reach the point where if it's another drop of alcohol, they could die, or it could be the loss of family, or it could be the loss of respect of family. And in this particular case, John Coltrane's passion was music, and it was the loss of the ability to play. He was so juiced up, he couldn't play. So this, and then the loss of respect of fellow musicians who would come up to him and say, "You're John Coltrane. Why are you messing yourself up like this?" It led him to cold turkey. Get off of drugs and alcohol with no help. That was painful. 2 weeks of it until he was finally clean. But because he had the discipline, you knew one thing. When he got off, he wasn't going back. And by the way, the whole time Coltrane was an addict and a drug addict and addicted to alcohol, he never lied, he never stole, he never did anything wrong. Meaning, usually those addictions bring out whatever's in you. Coltrane was a heck of a wonderful human being. They called him sweetness. And so when he got off of that, then he could go somewhere else. And so 2 weeks after Coltrane is off of drugs and alcohol, he's married to his first wife, Naima, who had been a big help to him in his life. And one morning he sits up in his bed and he has this beautiful look on his face. And Naima said, "John, what happened?" And John said, "I just heard a sound from heaven." It's the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. God was speaking to him through music, his ori, his ka, his destiny. He said it sounded like the droning sound, which is a sound that the Indian musicians play. And so this became like his inspiration. He had been apprenticing under Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk and had been thrown out of Miles' band because he was too juiced up. And so he goes back to working with Miles and Thelonious Monk, and he begins to find himself. And then he becomes an improviser, which is coming up with an original sound within an existing school. We think that's the highest range of creativity. It is not. Innovation is the highest range. That's where you create new schools of something. The Dogon call it Sodaya. It's understanding the cosmos and its ordered complexity, a part of it or most of it. These two are similar. So it's after years of practice, it's after cleaning himself up from drugs and alcohol that Coltrane ascends to his highest level, an innovator of 4 schools of music, but most important, an innovator of one of the most beautiful pieces of music that you've ever heard, and his longest piece. And by the way, his best-selling piece. And Coltrane never played for money. He always played for what his spirit was telling him he should bring out. And that greatest of all sounds that he produced was a love supreme. And most people say when they hear that, it leads them to want to get on their knees. Because Coltrane actually had problems with just about all religions. But he studied all of them. But he was ascending to the highest level he could as a spiritual human being. And he always said that he played his music to bring joy and happiness to others, which is what a lot of musicians say, a lot of artists say, Black artists especially. So Coltrane became an innovator of 4 schools of music after hard work, after a lot of practice, after years of apprenticeship, after overcoming addiction, and after God's intervention. Without God's intervention, no new sounds, not of this kind, So you're wondering what all this has to do with the vision of the just society. Einstein's theory of relativity, Auguste Kekule's discovery of the ring structure of benzene, George Washington Carver's massive innovations in science, John Coltrane's beautiful creation and innovation in music. And I really want to say that Coltrane's a real example of how you can't innovate something outside until you've done the inside work. He's a real example of that. And I would say about George Washington Carver, one reason why he was so receptive to God's mind was he was a humble human being. He was not a person running around bragging about what he could do. He could do this, he could do that. He was in service of his people. He was in service of humanity. And he was a deep believer in the mighty God, who he experienced directly. So what does all of this have to do with the formula for the just society, the key for unlocking the door to the just society? Now, I think it's very important because if innovations in science, in this case, chemistry or botany, are important, innovations in music are important. And they all need God's help to get to that plane that you can advance the science or the music or the art or whatever it may be. Then aren't innovations for restoring justice, harmony, and balance for human beings and for Mother Earth even more important? Isn't this the key to everything else? This is certainly the key to ending misery, poverty, powerlessness. It's the key to opening the door to our inner powers, though we can do that without just societies. Remember, what I'm going to be sharing with you, you can apply today. And even though you're around injustice, you can begin to create islands of justice. And it can spread. You hear me? And isn't this what would make God most happy? Wouldn't God be most happy if God could see on this planet that humans were living in a just state? As much as God loves the music, as Fool's Crow says, God's a sucker for music. And I would say especially good music, but God's definition of good is far greater than ours, you know? If God's moved by that, how much more is God moved by justice, by truth, which is the essence of what God is? How much is God moved by human happiness? And certainly wouldn't that just put a smile into God's light? I know God's not a human being. So the vision of the just society is good for Black folks because it arises from our rich history and culture. It's good for humanity because it's the key for justice for all human beings. And it's the fundamental cure to injustice. Now, what this vision has in common with the other breakthroughs that I previously described is that they comes from hard work. And you'll have to do your work. I can share the vision with you, but the intellectual way you learned in the West will not work for this to apply. You're going to have to put it inside yourself if you want to. And that takes work, but it's beautiful work. Some of you who meditate, they can be a part of that. In your relationships, to the extent that you already have that, use it. And to the extent that you don't, work on it, you know? It's a basis for how you can take whatever groups you're involved in your community and make them more balanced. It's a basis for raising your children. It's a basis for real love in your life. And I told you before, at my age, I didn't have too many reasons to get married other than the experience love. You know what I mean? That's important. That's real important, real love. And love comes without conditions. You're not in it because you want to get this or get that. It's just love. Serena Williams said, love's a beautiful feeling. I said, hey, Serena, you got it right. You got it right. So this takes hard work. So what is the key to the just societies that King, that Malcolm, that Ella Baker, that countless millions of Black folks, of people around the world have been searching for? A vision for just societies that has no holes and errors in it and can be applied to your life right now if you do the work. And please believe me, you will have to do some internal work. Because as Frederick Douglass said, the price of freedom is like the roar of the mighty oceans. It doesn't come without a struggle. It doesn't come without effort. So the vision of the just society is so simple that without God's beautiful light, I would have never figured this out. The linear, logical, lower mind loves complexity. It loves what's elaborate. But the heart mind, where God resides within each of us, it reduces the complex to very simple. Theory of relativity is very simple. The benzene ring is very simple. John Coltrane's droning sound, very simple. And what I'm going to offer you, very simple. What God revealed to me when and this had been a 30-year search at that point, because I had this vision in 1990, been in the movement 30 years, a scholar for 27 years, a conscious scholar. This is what I'd been looking for consciously for a number of years. And when God revealed this to me, I realized this came out of 100,000 years of historical practice. Black folks' practice of just societies for 100,000 years. This is where it came from. It had practice behind it. Say, I'm a rubber hit the road person. It's got to work. You know what I mean? It can sound ever so beautiful, but will it work? You can take your car to a mechanic and they can charge you all this money and your car breaks down. That didn't work. He just worked at getting your money. You know what I mean? So you got to be practical about this. This stuff has got to work. And so when it comes out of time-tested experience, and that's the wealth of your history, time-tested experience. You've been on the planet 144,000 years. According to mitochondrial DNA, all human beings come from Black folks. And the vision that the ancestors shared with me, that God shared with me through the beautiful light, this goes back to the earliest societies known to human beings. I knew that once this light was shared with me. And once I received the vision of this beautiful light, it's like a good public speaker. They talk to you on your level, you get it. God talks to you on your level, you get it. But you only get part of it. Over time, you see more of it. Over time, I've come to see that this vision for the just society that God shared with me through a very simple formula, a very simple key, I later began to see how this had been carried from Africa into the Western Hemisphere, how it had been carried into the Caribbean, how it had been carried into the United States, in Europe, where Africans reside today, how not in a pure form because of the nature of the oppression that we're under, and how it operates in the villages of Africa today. As John Henry Clark often said, the solutions for Africa's key to freedom are in its villages, because that's where you see people still observing traditions. They're in poverty, there's corruption, there's a whole lot of stuff going on that's wrong. But basically, that's where the old view still is alive. And that's where you really draw from building just societies today and tomorrow. And heavily, that's to be found in our women, and men and women both, but especially in our women. Also, when I looked at just societies before, the emphasis was on, because King and Malcolm, when they were looking at just societies, they were talking about how the system was not structured to distribute wealth, how it drove people into poverty. They were looking at that, and how it accentuated racism. And at their time, they weren't looking so much at the oppression of women, but how under the patriarchal system of the West, how women are exploited. That's something we've come to address more after their death. So there was this emphasis on the maldistribution of wealth and the way in which poverty was spread out across the globe. There wasn't so much emphasis on power. There was an emphasis on we needed a different kind of society that was balanced, but not so much of an idea of how power fit into this. And remember, King said he hadn't been trained in power, and none of us had been trained in just power, other than what we draw from our own culture. And the formulas that were out there, in this case, the Marxist formulas, and I'm not anti-Marxist, I'm just not a Marxist. There wasn't much emphasis on that there either in terms of power distribution, other than that the working class should have it. And in America and in the West, the working class has not exactly been our allies, to put it mildly. In fact, Biden couldn't win away Trump's working class base. And Trump sold them a false bill of goods, fake populism. He went into office talking about an infrastructure plan and never did it. Biden is trying to do it, in part because I don't think he had enough sense to know how to do it. And whatever he did, he would have to manage it himself. So the best thing he could do is get out on the road and spout lies and tweet, you know? So he lost a ripe opportunity. Plus, he wasn't in there to serve the poor anyway. So he had no real motivation to do it in the first place. So what is this vision for the just society? I was sitting in my study. This was in 1990, and I had written 190 pages of the mother principle. And then I got a question, because I had been, prior to writing, a good friend of mine, Dewey Crumpler, who's a mural artist, a magnificent mural artist. I asked him to let me borrow a statue of the Numo twins that you see behind me, those two Dogon statues. He had two old ones, which means these were full of spirit power. So I would pray to the Dogon before I wrote each morning that they would help me with some vision of just societies that would go beyond facts, that would offer our people and humanity a way out of the oppressive trap they were in. And so when I asked myself the question, what did the Dogon mean by the just society? I knew instantly I was in trouble. Been in the system for about 26, 27 years, and I'm asking that question, means I didn't know. And so I knew I had to throw away 180 pages. That don't bother me. What bothered me was I didn't know, you know? And so when I asked the question, what did the Dogon mean by the just society? I saw this beautiful light. And that's the way God communicates with me. George Washington Carver, it was communicating with plants, or through dreams, or through his creative science, or Coltrane through the sound of music, Einstein through dreams and intuition. For me, it's the light. And telepathically, without speaking, the light conveys a message. And in this case, and this is it, I'm going to give this to you, and this is the formula. This is the secret basis for why the ancient societies of Africa didn't have the division of rich and poor, didn't have the abuse of women by men or the abuse of children, as Sheikh Diop pointed out. In ancient African societies, you didn't have systematic abuse of women. And there's a a British European, Macaulay, who traveled from one end of Africa to the other, and this was in the 19th century, and observed that he never experienced crime. He never experienced oppression. He never experienced hunger. Everywhere he went, he was safe and people were happy. He said it's going to be rough conquering a people like this. Imagine you're in a heaven on earth and you're thinking about conquering people. Why don't you think about how could you replicate that in your own society? Because you're conquest oriented. But the key point is, there was a time before the coming of Islam and Christianity where Africans lived in balance. Wasn't perfect, but it was awful close. So when I asked God for the answer and I received this beautiful light, this was what the light said telepathically without speaking. The light said, the just societies, get this real straight. And it's in chapter 6 of the Mother Principle. You need to read the whole book. It's chapter 6 where this is described. The light said, telepathically without speaking, the just societies of Africa were those where all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. Let me repeat that. The just societies of Africa were those where all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. God didn't say just societies was based on checks and balances, the executive checking the legislative or the executive or the judicial. It didn't say it was based on a few people representing everybody. You call Republican government. It certainly didn't say it was based on a society where government is set up to protect private property, which is what this government is based on. John Locke's second treatise on government didn't say that. It said the just societies of Africa were those where all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. When that vision came, God speaking to me telepathically on my level, I knew instantly what God was telling me. God was telling me that Chwa societies, the hunter-gatherer societies, were the societies where all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. I knew that, but I had never understood before the secret basis for their balance. These were the most just societies on the planet. As Gerard Klosch says, historian, these were the most affluent societies that humans ever created, where people spent a few hours gathering, women gathered, men hunting, and the rest of the time was spent in leisure. That's why they lived in this society beginning 144,000 years for 100,000 years. And then women invented agriculture, but still, many still remained in the hunter-gatherer society, but then many went into the agricultural order. And by the way, these Twa gave birth to Kemet. They're the Anu, A-N-U. That's a story for another time. So in these societies, and if you think about it, what's the key to just society? Societies are made up of men and women. I remember telling my mother about this. My mother's very smart, straight A student when she went to school. Very smart, insightful, poetic woman who was into love, called her teacher love. I told her what this vision was. She said, what makes more sense? She says, I've been looking for this all my life. In a society of males and females, what makes more sense than males and females should be equally empowered, not one having more power than the other. My mother was a Leo. I am too. I'm a quadruple Leo, 4 planets in Leo. My mother was a real Leo. And she always said, this is kind of funny. She'd say, why'd they make me a lioness? The lioness doesn't have the mane. I'm a lion. Or I see these bluebirds flying around here. Well, the prettiest one is the male. He's got the crown. You know what I mean? So my mother said, what's up with that? Because my mother's one of the finest women you'd ever lay your eyes on. You know what I mean? So the idea that in the animal kingdom, there could be an animal that she's supposedly descended from astrologically that could be prettier than her. Oh, no. You know what I mean? Give her the mane. They called her queen. You know what I mean? But the point is, so the formula for just societies is, in a society of males and females, the formula is males have no more power than females. Females have no more power than males. They're balanced. Of course, you'll say nothing's perfect, huh? But the fact of the matter is, that's the model. That's the key. When you're talking about reworking and restructuring a society, that's your basis. The Iroquois Confederacy had something like that among Native Americans. It wasn't exactly that, but it was very much like that, a male-female thing. They called theirs matriarchal. It really wasn't. By the way, when I had this vision, and then afterwards I went to Africa, started doing research, was in the villages, was in Ghana. I was working with the greatest healer in Ghana, the Queen Mother, a healing Queen Mother in Ghana with Leonard Jeffries and Rosalind Jeffries, and just looking at African societies in 1990, right after this vision. And I could see this model all over the place. Africa's based on this because for 100,000 years, Africans had existed in this balanced state. So when they move into agrarian orders, they bring this into their societies. And so even when societies are fractured through the slave trade, we're bringing this into the Americas. And if you read the slave narratives and you hear about love on the plantation, the ones where it really worked, brothers who lived to 90 and 100, and some of them lived to 120, they talk about how they loved this Black woman. One brother talking about he's coming out of the field and he sees this sister coming out with cotton all in her hair. And he's talking about how beautiful she was. And he said he would break his feet up the road to see her, because in enslavement, you didn't want to marry somebody on the same plantation. You didn't want to see some of the stuff that happened. So it was usually the neighboring plantation. So he had to get permission from her mother and father to marry. But the point is, these were slave narratives. He was being interviewed later, and he was talking about how it brought nothing but joy for him in his whole life. He loved this Black woman. You hear me? And so I call this model not matriarchy, ruled by females, society ruled by females, not patriarchy, societies ruled by males, not matrilineal, last name comes from the female's family, though that may be the case, and not patrilineal, last name comes from the male's family. I came up with a new term. Dr. Theophil Obenga, greatest scholar on ancient Kemet, said this term should be in the dictionary. I call it twinlineal, meaning your lineage is both grandmother and grandfather. You're descended from both. Great grandmother, great grandfather, father, mother. Even if in your generation, some of you don't know your father, you have both. And it, again, is based on lines of power, but it's also based on masculine and feminine qualities that reside inside of each other. Issues I was dealing with, issues that we all have to deal with, which is really, when we synthesize those, is the basis for our humanity. So the restructuring of society, the keys to just society begin inside you, your masculine and feminine side, within your relationships, in your families, and in your communities, and in your extended family. And these are things you can apply to today. When you have that kind of balance in a family relationship, assuming that you have other things working for you, because there are other things that are required for a relationship to work, and we're going to get into some of that here, then that's when you have your heaven on earth. I don't care how much oppression you're facing. I enjoy the fight. So you know what I mean? As long as it's right. Huh? Ain't nobody terrorizing me. I'm the terror, you know? So when King said that by 1965, the movement had gone beyond civil rights to human rights, he meant that the movement had gone beyond a constitution that was written by and for a few white men who owned property and granted to them the right to vote, excluded women, excluded Blacks. We were treated as property. King knew that the next phase of the struggle was going to have to deal with power, and it was going to have to deal with redistribution of power. And what I'm suggesting is the models for just societies, the basic redistribution has got to be around males and females. And as we shift the geographic or the ethnic composition of this country, then that means there's going to be a balance shifting in terms of numbers for Blacks and people of color. And in time, that's going to be reflected in power. And you're going to have the vision of something that's an alternative to what you're raised up and oppressed under to put in place of this. And that's vision for the just society. So the formula that worked for 100,000 years is a formula that can work today, because societies are still made up of males and females. And you may say, yeah, they're larger than a hunting band. Yeah, and they were larger in Africa. They applied these models to kingdoms, you know. Sometimes the principles were applied directly, sometimes they were applied indirectly. And by the way, Africans gave birth to democracy, not the Greeks. I pointed this out before. And in Greece, it was limited for a short period of time to Athens, to 25,000 people. And how can the West claim they got a democratic heritage that was limited to 25,000 people in the Mediterranean? Ours is in our blood system because it runs through societies for 144,000 years, going back to the very beginning. And then it runs through the agrarian societies, the stratified and the ones without kings and queens. The Ella Baker style of leadership flows from this, where it's group-centered as opposed to individuals. It's the idea of everybody's got to say so. And by the way, this is the model for empowering Black communities today, whether in the US or globally. Everybody's got to assume some role of leadership. And that's why the Black Lives Matter movement was so effective, is that you had all these networks, and then using this new technology, so many different ways to communicate, it throws your enemy off balance. But more important, our breakdowns are so great in Black communities that if we do not spread the leadership out, we're not going to be able to address these problems. And so this is a good model for today as well. So this show will go into this in depth at a later point. And I would say it's important that what you need to do is draw more people into this show, because I need to be sharing this with the largest number. And it's important that you read and digest this, because this is a gift of God, and it's a gift that can help you. And if you can build it into your life, it's something you can live right now, I know. And the people I'm dedicating this show to, the Levine family, they know. And there's a whole bunch of families like this. You hear me? But it's not just the family, it's you. It's inside of each of us. So the topic for this show has been the key that unlocks the door to just societies. The key's inside of you, inside the masculine and feminine inside of you. It's inside your history. It's inside your culture. It's inside the best of your humanity. And it is not only good for you, it's good for human beings the world over. So I hope you got something out of this. Always leave the best to the end. And just remember, you got the power to do whatever you want to change your life for good and to change it so that it benefits humanity as well. Hotep. I'm going to go to questions once I get something out of the way here. Okay, see where there are questions. Francine Leonard makes the comment that they're coming out with a couple of movies to explain that there was oil in Tulsa and there were wealthy Native Americans and wealthy Black people. Yeah, I pointed out earlier that my mother had met one of those, and he in fact wanted to marry her and she didn't. He had his own plane and he had a custom car that he flew around with in this plane. Let's see if there are any questions here. Shit. Okay, there are a few comments here from Diane Littles, Steve McKenzie, Hotep, Tashaka and family, Francine Litter, the key that unlocks the door to just societies, Janae Johnson, greetings, Dr. Tashaka, listening deeply. Thank you for your loving service. Janae Johnson, amen. The people have the power, it's in the community. You got that right. That's a key point that I hope you get from the vision for just societies, is that it's all in the people. And it's particularly in us, especially when we get ourselves in balance and in harmony and in love with ourselves. M.A. Davis, honor and blessings to you. This is so important. I'm grateful. And then there's a comment here. No romance without finance. Francine, liberal is the neoliberalism that you mentioned. Is it anything like a commodity or a type of slavery system? Neoliberalism is a doctrine developed in the United States. And it's basically the doctrine that it comes in under the disguise that big government is bad and that everything that's good comes from the private economy, and that everything in sight should be placed under private ownership. That's the basic idea of neoliberalism. And it's also used to justify moving out of things like low-income housing. You know, why should the government provide that? Reagan comes in with this idea that the government is the problem, when in fact, the government's always been the big solution for big business because they got their wealth out of the defense budget and other things. And it helped to raise a lot of people out of poverty through the New Deal. So Reagan ushers in this idea with his new neoliberal economist, Friedman, and they begin to test this, as I pointed out in previous shows, in Chile and in Indonesia, where in Chile they overthrew Salvador Allende and then put in place neoliberal economists trained at the University of Chicago. And they began to privatize everything in sight. And then they do the same thing in Indonesia and overthrow the government of Sukarno, who was looking out for the well-being of the people. They murder 1 million Indonesians and they bring in UC Berkeley trained neoliberal economists, and they begin to privatize everything there. Why did they want to privatize things in Indonesia? Huge amount of oil. It's one of the wealthiest, or one of the nations that has one of the largest supplies of oil. Is Islamic. And so that was tried out there and then brought to the United States. And so here it's meant pulling back from the programs that would benefit the people, low-income housing, higher wages, various programs that were beneficial to the poor, including welfare that Clinton ended. But putting everything you can into the pockets of the rich. This is partially why the rich have gotten to be richer. So that's neoliberalism, and it's been brought to Africa. And in my show that dealt with the weakening of African families in Africa, I dealt with the neoliberalism practice in Africa. So that's kind of neoliberalism in a nutshell. And I think, let's see if there's anything else. Okay, I think that's it. So thanks. I hope people got something out of this. I enjoyed doing this. I'm going to have a special show next week. You'll find out what it is shortly. Hotep.